Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing Haiti. Now, ever since the assassination of President Moïse of Haiti, there have been a lot of theories about who exactly carried out the assassination and why. And we will come to the why, but one of the theories that is out there is that possibly the Americans were involved in some way. We know that there were a number of apparently Colombian mercenaries as well amongst the group that is responsible for the assassination of President Moïse. The Americans who are involved in those who did at some point in time in their past go through U.S. military training. Does that mean that there is a direct link to the U.S. government? Obviously, we do not know that factually or for sure, but nevertheless, we also know that Haiti does have a past when it comes to American involvement overall in the country, both, I would think, good and bad, and that we can put to our guests who are both joining us today from New York. And joining us from Brooklyn, New York is Dr. John Eddy St. Paul, who is the founder of the Haitian Studies Institute. He's also a Brooklyn College sociology professor. He's joining us today, as I said, from Brooklyn. Joining us from Syracuse is Dr. Jonassaint, who is a professor at Syracuse University, the Department of Languages, Literature, and Linguistics. Jonassaint and John Eddy St. Paul, thank you both for taking your time out this morning to speak to us. Now, Dr. Paul, I'd like to start with you first. What do you make of firstly, the assassination of President Moïse and possible foreign involvement?
I think in your introduction, you pointed it out in a very good fashion that when it comes to Haiti, Western power have always been involved. Western power has always shaped internal policy in Haiti. For instance, in the context of the Monroe Doctrine, and I do think that we are still dealing with the Monroe Doctrine, nothing happened in this continent in America without the approval, or at least without the fact that the U.S. know what is happening. So I do think that the assassination of Jovenel Moïse, we cannot say who actually are the main actor involved, but I do think that the U.S. should know about what was going on in Haiti before the assassination.
Dr. Jonassaint, do you think that the U.S. government was involved?
Frankly, I don't think so. I don't see any interest for the American to be involved in this kind of mess, especially today. But as my colleague pointed out, maybe there is some connection, loose connection or strong connection. Nobody knows for now. And to me, the most important question is not who or why, is if the Haitian people, the Haitian elite can seize this moment to change course, because that's the most important. This is a very tragic event, and I'm seeing late President Moïse like a kind of Christ. And we can use this moment to change course. If we are able to get together and build something around the reconstruction of the country, that's what the most important thing for me. Because whatsoever, I don't think we will know at any time who is really behind this big event. I don't think so.
So, Dr. Paul, what can be learned from it at the very least then? How can the country move forward knowing full well that, somebody could come from the outside in and even assassinate a sitting president?
So I would like to not disagree, but I would nuance Professor Jonassaint's statement. I think that the U.S. has a lot of interest in Haiti. I won't say that the U.S. was like directly involved in the assassination of the president. But the U.S. has always had strong interest in Haiti, and most recently, I published an article entitled Understanding Haiti Through the Social Forces in Interaction. And in that article that was published in Georgetown Journal of International Affairs, I explained that since 1804, since the very inception of Haiti as the first Black empire in Western Hemisphere, there has been always some international, transnational social forces that have always attempted to put their feet on the neck of Haiti. And we couldn't understand, for instance, the claim of Professor Jonassaint for the Haitian elite without understanding the way that politics play in Haiti and how U.S. foreign policy has negatively shaped both the Haitian society and politics in Haiti.
So, Dr. Jonassaint, going forward then, what do you make as well of what the investigation may show? And as you both have alluded to, we may not know 100%, of course, what happened here and who specifically was involved and why. But there's also then the involvement of the Colombians. Why would the Colombians be involved in this, do you think?
But let me lay out something that I think everyone agrees upon it now. The president was tortured, probably 2 hours of torture. So it seems to me that's not a kind of political assassination, at least for the first time in history that happened, if it's a political assassination. So I guess there is something more than political. I don't know exactly what is it. Is maybe the reason why you have so many confusion. According to some sources, the Colombians said that when they arrived in the house, the president was already dead. Is it true? I don't know. Some sources said also the Colombian brought the wife of the former president, of the late president in the United States. So what's going on? How people involved in this kind of assassination couldn't get access to U.S. land? I don't know. But as I said, the main question is how can we rebuild the country? How can we go forward? Obviously, politics play a big role in Haiti, and I am aware of that. One of my uncles was president of Haiti. I have two uncles who was president of Haiti, so I know, I cannot see very well, but I know pretty well the political elite and bourgeoisie in Haiti. And people always think they are very powerful, they are evil, but it's not really true. I think there is a lot of misunderstanding of what's going on in Haiti so often. Because everyone in this country, especially in the top 10, are linked. They are together at one point or another. You know, they have some connection, family connection, friendship connection, and so on and so forth. So that's create also a big problem because we cannot take clear position because you are always someone that you know someone and someone knowing someone else, and you cannot go to some investigation. So that's create a lot of problem because it's a very small country, a very small number of players, and they are all together. So, but again, if we can focus on this tragic event and say, let's go forward and try to have a clear agenda with a clear timetable, with clear goals to build the country.
Yeah,
I think that's the most important because we can spend millions of dollars and trying to know who killed the president. That will not save the problem of Haitian people.
That's the point, isn't it, Dr. Paul? I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. How does the country move forward? And as Dr. Jonassaint there said, it's also a question of resources. How many resources can the country actually put towards a proper investigation, which will be long-term? If we're completely honest, these things will take a very long time to investigate. Who and how do we lead the country going forward in a proper fashion, where then we're able to then get over the many crises that the country faces?
I am both a political theorist and a political sociologist, and to answer that question, for instance, I think I have to push back on what my colleague Jonassaint said. To answer your question, for instance, when you ask why Colombians were involved, it is important to know that since 2000, because I got my master's degree from a Colombian university in Bogota, since 2000, it was under the administration of Andres Pastrana, the then president of Colombia. Haiti has started to become a narco state, because in 2000 there was a thing that was called Plan Colombia. The Plan Colombia was signed in U.S. Congress, and the Plan Colombia pushed, Colombian politicians to tackle, narco stupefacient, narco traffic. And since then, Haiti has become a route for the transition of drug from South America to the United States of America. So since then, we have the making of Haiti as a narco state. So the assassination of President Jovenel Moïse respond to what we call in political science transnational crime. And we cannot talk about transnational crime thinking that the U.S. is not involved to some degree. That is very important. So it is a kind of transnational crime. Also, another important thing to point out, because we cannot move forward without understanding the roots of the problem. Yeah. Professor Jonassaint said that Jovenel Moïse was tortured. It was the first time in the history of Haiti that has happened. I don't think so, because on October 17, 1806, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the Emperor Jacques I, he was tortured and he was decapitated more than Jovenel Moïse. So this is something that we have to bear in mind. Although Moïse administration or Moïse politics and policies were quite different than Jacques first, the king Jacques first, but there are certain similitudes between both kind of assassination. So I think the assassination of Jovenel Moïse is complex. We need to really understand the historical roots of the problem, but the state doesn't operate, politics doesn't operate, as Professor Jonassaint said. It's not only the elite. Because in Haiti, we don't have, for instance, an elite. We don't have a bourgeoisie. We don't have a national bourgeoisie. We have neo-colonial economic actors. They call themselves the private sector of business. But in Haiti, we don't have a national bourgeoisie. So the situation of Haiti is complex. In order to move forward, I think the U.S. should give, for instance, to recognize, because in Haiti, there are many grassroots organizations from the civil society that are fighting for the recognition of Haitian sovereignty. I think
and they need support. Dr. Paul, I do sincerely apologize for cutting you off. Unfortunately, the clock has gotten the best of us. I know that we have only just started talking about the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the issues when it comes to Haiti, but I really, really appreciate both of you taking your time out this morning and for giving us the context of this and giving us your respective viewpoints on this. It's really, really important for us to understand what's happened in Haiti in the past, what's happening right now, and what the future as well holds, as well as an external involvement, be it Colombia, be it the United States. As I said, we really appreciate the insight and expertise you brought to the discussion. That was Jean-Eddy St. Paul and Jean Jonassaint speaking about Haiti. We were discussing there the assassination of President Moïse. As we know, this has brought forth then a new crisis in the country. Will the country be able to move forward beyond this and create then a better future? Because so far we've just had crises upon crises facing the country. And as always, it's the people, the Haitian people in the middle, who then are the ones suffering the most, while the elite, siphon off money and or live fairly comfortable lives in context. And that's unfortunately the reality in such situations anywhere in the world as well. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, a French newspaper has done an expose, essentially, on that entire controversy, which has been going on for a while now, between a cement maker named Lafarge, that cement maker company, in fact, which operates in Syria, and supposedly then came to a deal with ISIS of some sort, and that has obviously been in front of the courts for a while now. It seems that the French intelligence agencies were aware of transactions between Lafarge and ISIS in Syria, so that Lafarge could continue its operations at the cement factory. What does this mean about why then the French intelligence agencies didn't stop those transactions altogether? Was there government involvement? I mean, obviously that would be a huge allegation to make, but at the very least they were aware. So the huge question mark is then why not stop that? For very obvious reasons, that would be, and those would be transactions which would be deemed illegal for the fact that obviously ISIS is acceptably a terrorist group by all around the world. Let's discuss that a bit further. We're now joined by Marco Sassòli, who is an international law expert. He's a professor of international law at the University of Geneva. He's joining us from Geneva today. Joining us from Marseille in France is Dr. Joseph Downing, who is a fellow in nationalism at the European Institute at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Joseph and Marco, thank you both for taking your time out of your busy schedules to join us today. Joseph, let me start with you. Why do you think it is that intelligence agencies didn't act? I mean, they knew, and one would think that obviously in their respective positions, they probably could have done a lot more.
Definitely. I mean, but one problem that intelligence agencies always face is the decision on when to act on information. So if you act on information, you then risk giving up your sources and blowing the cover of the sources of that intelligence, right? So to actually act on intelligence, security services have to make a calculated risk assessment to say, is this worth us strategically possibly giving up our sources of information, or is it something that's better left alone so that we can gain even better information on even more more pressing security issues? The second thing is, I mean, one thing that's quite unfortunate to say is that large companies are quite commonly pay large bribes to do to operate in not just conflict context, but all over the world. BAE Systems in the United Kingdom. So also it could be that the intelligence services picked this up and just saw it as one of a string of broader cases where sort of, shady payments were being made to shady actors all across the globe, really.
Marco, what are your thoughts about this? Certainly, as I said in my introduction, it would be a huge allegation to make that the French government directly would have been okay with this sort of transaction. But nevertheless, the fact that somebody in the establishment knew and didn't do anything, and we're now at this point in this entire situation, that doesn't really look very good on France, does it?
Well, I think we have to distinguish the French secret services and Lafarge. The French secret services, indeed, as France has put ISIS on the list of terrorist organizations, under French law, it is unlawful to interact with ISIS. Now, for Lafarge, obviously, the problem is, in my view, slightly different. You have either you say all business is immoral, or all business abroad is immoral, or you should only make business in democracies perfectly complying with human rights, or you will inevitably be confronted of working in a place where those in charge commit violations of international law. And then the dilemma is, do you stop? Which also means that the people on the spot lose their jobs and the local economy goes even more down? Or do you continue? And if you continue, you have to interact with those in charge. I mean, if you want to make business with China, you have to interact with the Chinese authorities, pay them money, and so on. And now, do we make a big difference between a state and an armed group? This is the normal approach, indeed, of states, because states consider that even the most criminal state is much better than any armed group.
But Marco, just for the sake of argument, I apologize for interrupting you, but just on the point that you make, and I completely take your point, so I don't want to take away from the point you just made, and it's a very pertinent one. But if we then take the example, and I'm just using this as an example, and I know that Iran, for example, is a sanctioned country, but we also had European companies that, after the nuclear deal, came into Iran and then walked away from it, right? So in that case, business interests took a second, it came in the list as a second priority versus the first priority of saving themselves from the sanctions, right? And they weren't able to work around that. But in this case, for them, Lafarge to prioritize still working and operating in Syria versus, working with a terrorist group, you know what I mean? Like, I know it's not an exact comparison, but it just seems like it's odd that it's somewhat understandable in this case, but not in the other.
In all this, you are pointing to those double standards. But I mean, if it goes, and in the French procedure, one part is about complicity and crimes against humanity. And it is absolutely clear that the so-called Islamic State committed crimes against humanity. Now to claim that as soon as you pay money, not with the intent to further their crimes against humanity, but to operate in regions they control. And currently some 20 million people in the world live in regions under control of armed groups. Yeah. Then that this may be immoral, okay. But that it's complicity with the crimes against humanity, then the same standard must apply if you have transactions with a state which commits crimes against humanity. And as you know, there are quite a number of such states.
Indeed. Okay, so this certainly creates for us, and I totally take the point there that both of you have made as well, that this is a lot more complex than meets the eye, certainly. But even in this situation, I mean, I'm just thinking about the very obvious optics here, right? So France has also been involved in places like Sahel to fight groups like ISIS and, and other terror groups, Boko Haram, etc. I mean, the list is quite endless that we can probably put out there. Just in this one specific case, I mean, I'm just still having a very hard time wrapping my mind around the fact that the intelligence agencies did not immediately jump on this. What are your thoughts?
No, it definitely points to what seems on the surface as a double standard, but from a strategic perspective, France and France's intelligence agencies are mainly preoccupied, especially in the current era that we're in preventing attacks on French soil. So there was a massive concern about the large number of French jihadists that went to Syria to fight with ISIS. And it could have been that the French security services made a strategic calculation and said, okay, we can give up our sources, we can intervene to sanction a cement company, or we can prioritize national security, we can prioritize the observance of foreign fighters within Syria, we can prioritize keeping our intelligence links secret so that they can feed us information about the possible planning of attacks on French soil. So it's one of the things about the murky world of intelligence is that these calculations have to be made. Now, these calculations are not palatable to a civilian audience, and definitely do create these kinds of double standards where you have on the one side the French military, as you say, operating in the Sahel region of Central Africa, and at the same against sort of Islamic State-inspired type militant groups, although they're not the same, but there's a similar kind of trajectory there. And then not stopping a French company from making payments to the Islamic State in Syria. There's also another dimension to this, which is it's not just the Islamic that the company made payments to. They also made payments to Kurdish groups. They also made payments to the Nusra Front. So one of the issues as well with Syria at that particular time is that the groups, the strategic interests, which side the groups were on, was a very fluid situation as well. So that adds a level of complexity. Another level of complexity to this is, and I agree totally with Marco here, that I think the connection to crimes against humanity is a little bit overblown here, right? So, it's a cement company paying bribes to a repugnant armed group, but not specifically to go out of their way to commit these gross human rights violations. However, there is a strategic element here. Erdogan, the president of Turkey, made allegations that the cement from this plant in Syria was used to make tunnels underneath the Turkish border in northern Syria. So there is an added sort of security dimension here. We can look at cement as a civilian product, but cement does have important, if low-tech, military and strategic uses, right?
Indeed.
That are also important to consider.
We're quickly running out of time, so Marco, I'll give you the final word. On the issue of then financing, right? Because obviously the money that was given to ISIS, however much it may have been, and I've read the figure that's been put out there, but I wonder, terrorist financing, then I believe that's one of the charges against this company at this point in time. Is that a fair charge? Because as we can imagine, ISIS would have used that for some purpose, right, to keep itself operating and going, and that in and of itself then furthers its cause in some way?
Yes, well, there are Security Council resolutions which demand of all states to criminalize the financing of terrorist groups, which are labeled as terrorists by the UN. And then, under French law, it is indeed a crime to pay for whatever purposes, hopefully with an exception for humanitarian purposes, money to an armed group, which is labeled as terrorist. I think the humanitarian issue is an important issue because, if you want to help the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, you have to work with Hamas. And Hamas is not on a UN list, but it is on a list of the US and the European states. And here, I don't compare Hamas with the so-called Islamic State, but it shows the dilemma. If you run a business in the Gaza Strip, do you withdraw as long as Hamas is in charge there? Or do you try to continue to produce things and to give jobs to the population? But it is clear that under French law and under Security Council resolutions, this is unlawful to pay.
Well, we'll leave there as our final comment. I know we just touched the crux of the matter. I'm sure there's a lot more to discuss in depth about this, but we really appreciate Marco and Joseph for putting this into context for us and for explaining out the complexities of companies working in places around the world which are not ideal when we're discussing then human rights or a whole bunch of other issues as well. Again, to me, at least on a personal basis, viewing this, it does seem kind of unfathomable that the French intelligence would allow for this to continue, even though they knew of it. What kind of a message have they sent? What kind of a precedent then will this case against Lafarge set for other companies in areas around the world which are then under the spotlight because of human rights issues? Those are really, really important considerations, I would think, for many corporations, global corporations, going forward. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi, and in the final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Iran, and a lot's happened. So we've had the president of Iran, who's on his way out, by the way, President Rouhani, saying that Iran could, if it so chooses, enrich uranium to a 90% purity, which would, as we know, be weapons grade. But I feel the more important aspect of what's happened recently is the document that's been submitted to the Iranian parliament by the outgoing Iranian foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, about Iran being essentially one step away from gaining everything that it so wants within the JCPOA, and that the United States would then re-enter the deal as well. Those are, of course, I'm paraphrasing his words. That has created some waves and some rift within Iran itself, because, I mean, just from the outside in, and I was somebody who was there in Iran when the nuclear deal was signed, how much legitimacy can we really give to Zarif's own words? Because his words were, even at that time, that the nuclear deal, or the sanctions, pardon me, would all be lifted in one go the next day of the JCPOA being signed. And as we all know, and the record shows, that did not, in fact, happen just in the way that Zarif had so promised. Let's discuss those issues a bit further. And I join with Dr. Atefeh Toghyani, who is a visiting professor at the University of Tehran. She's joining us today from the Iranian capital. Joining us this morning from Portland, Oregon, is Dr. Robert Asaadi, who is an instructor of political science and international studies at Portland State University. He's also the author of Post-Revolutionary Iran, The Leader, the People, and the Three Powers. Robert and Atefeh, thank you both for your time today. Atefeh, let me start with you. Let's start with, firstly, President Rouhani saying that Iran can choose to enrich uranium to 90% purity. Why would he even say that? I mean, to me, it sounds like he's almost giving more reason for the world not to trust Iran.
Let me start from a couple of years later to answer your question. Of course, in 2017, U.S. Congress voted in favor of the COTSA law, which implemented later with Trump's signature. And under COTSA law, the U.S. president is required to impose sanctions on Iran's missile program, military purchases, or IRGC, or IRGC's foreign collaboration, and of course, those who violate human rights in Iran, of course, based on their own interpretation of violation of human rights. But the law also allows for a temporary suspension of the sanctions. Iran demands the lifting of all sanctions in Vienna. But of course, COTSA sanctions will not be lifted while they have been implemented after JCPOA. And JCPOA bans any further sanctions on Iran on the one hand, and it has nothing to do with the nuclear weapon. So, on the other hand, because it was approved by Congress, the Biden government could not do anything about it. But the COTSA sanctions are so severe that, along with other sanctions that will not be lifted, the JCPOA agreement will not be of practical benefit to the country. Biden has agreed to lift some of COTSA's sanctions for several months as part of the Vienna talk, but then he have to extend the lifting every few months, every 6 months. But in these circumstances, no foreign company will accept the risk of investing in Iran or interacting with Iran in fear of that extension would not happen by Biden. Yeah. The second and bigger problem is that when Iran reaches out to the United States in 6 months and demand an extension of the lifting of sanctions, the United States make new demands. For example, the missile program or human rights issues that have been always the issue. And so Iran is not gaining any profit out of this JCPOA. The new JCPOA is totally different from the one that has been accepted in 2015. So the president is trying to just put pressure on Western countries to convince them for this COTSA law.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but this, to me, seems like Rouhani, Zarif, and others are already trying to remain relevant going into the fact that they're about to walk away from office themselves, and they've been under severe criticism, as I'm sure you're well aware, in Iran for the fact that the nuclear deal has, for all intents and purposes, not served the Iranians economically or otherwise in the way that had been hoped. Is this sort of rhetoric, as in talking about 90% enrichment agreement, the talk on the part of Zarif that, listen, we're just one step away from signing something in Vienna and, sanctions will be lifted. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So I actually view Zarif's statement less as the next step in Iran's domestic politics, as you suggest, and more as the next piece in the nuclear negotiations themselves. So I think it's fairly obvious to see that as to see his statement as an attempt to gain leverage in a future negotiation involving the United States. I actually think this moment is very critical just to re-examine, go back to kind of first principles. What was the JCPOA all about? What was it trying to achieve? And just to remind your viewers, a basic summary of the logic of the JCPOA was that Iran would follow some additional measures regarding its nuclear program outside of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is the international legal regime governing the nuclear behavior of states. For example, Iran agrees to limit uranium enrichment, reduce uranium stockpile, agree to IAEA continuous monitoring above that prescribed by the NPT, for instance. And the payoff, as the previous speaker mentioned, was sanctions relief. So all of these additional measures were oriented to achieve the unfreezing of some $100 billion of Iranian assets abroad and reduce the sanctions in a scaled manner. Of course, we know that hasn't happened, that hasn't been delivered. So I think it's a really important piece to examine here is what credibility does the United States and the international partners who were party to the JCPOA, what can they now assure Iran in terms of sanctions relief? So why should Iran go back to the table knowing precisely that one of the major political parties in the United States, the Republican Party, completely opposes the notion of sanctions relief for Iran because of not only the nuclear program, but these other issues that my colleague on the panel mentioned, like Iran's human rights behavior and so on.
Atefeh, we can talk about the Republicans on the American side, and then we can talk about principalists in Iran, right? So we have Raisi coming into office. Raisi, from what we've understood, is going to be tougher than the Rouhani administration was in negotiations, be it in Vienna or even in his just dealings with the Americans overall. Is it a wait-and-see game on that side as well, in the sense that there will be a hugely different policy under Raisi towards the Americans and the nuclear deal?
In fact, I don't think so. The nuclear deal was something beyond one state inside Iran. It was something that, in fact, in deep state of Iran, there was some acceptance and there was some consensus that this JCPOA should happen. And they have to put pressure on all the system or all the actors to accomplish this resolution. So I think that even by the presidency of President Raisi, there would not be a huge change in Iran's policy toward JCPOA. Of course, there were some discourses and arguments inside for just diminishing the JCPOA, but I think that it's only the discourses, and the consensus that exists among elites inside Iran is that JCPOA is the first priority of the state that is coming, and I don't expect a huge change. Maybe the features, the figures should maybe change, but the whole policy should not.
Robert, you know, for a lot of us who've been watching this, as I'm sure you have as well, ever since the United States walked away from this, the Europeans have tried to hold on to this deal for dear life, right? They've offered a few measures such as Instex and otherwise to try to appease the Iranians, but there hasn't been enough of appeasement, certainly in the Iranians' eyes. What do you think will happen under Raisi? Raisi, you know, Atefeh there mentioned that yes, the establishment as a whole, beyond just the president's office in Iran, Iran signed on to the deal, seemingly, or at least gave it a green light. But I would think that the reality is very different, even domestically in Iran right now still. Should we expect possibly that Raisi will be a lot tougher? And then what does that then mean for the Americans?
Yeah, this is, I think, a very difficult question to predict. I would say that it goes back to something very fundamental about the nature of the nuclear issue in Iran. Of course, Iran was and remains a state that signed and ratified the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, in 1968. After the Islamic Revolution, the new government maintained that commitment. The dilemma, in a sense, is that Iran interprets their obligations under the NPT quite differently than the United States and the European powers, even to some extent, that Iran emphasizes a rights-based interpretation of the NPT, referring basically to Article 4 of that document, which says, as is a slogan in Iran, that nuclear energy is an inalienable right of all states that are non-nuclear weapon states that sign the NPT. And so this is very much a question of national sovereignty and independence. And so there's a high degree of symbolism and national pride at stake regarding the nuclear energy program. And of course, Iran has maintained, regardless of what government we're speaking of, that they are not seeking nuclear weapons. The United States and others view that claim with some degree of skepticism, but that's essentially a non-starter in the negotiation. The United States, on the other hand, focuses on an obligations-based approach of the NPT, which says, prioritizing Articles 1 and 2 of that document, the non-proliferation piece, basically, the security dynamic. So I suspect what will happen when the Raisi government transitions is we will see a more hardline approach to the negotiation, frankly, because the path that was followed by Foreign Minister Zarif and Rouhani didn't bear the fruit in terms of sanctions relief that was hoped for.
Indeed. Atefeh, I'll give you the final before I let both of you go. There are some regional realities as well, right? The region is changing. It seems the United States wants to lessen its involvement in the Middle East, and for that, it needs somewhat good relations with Iran, right? At least relations where at least they're not as adversarial as right now. There's a huge reality of Afghanistan as well, for example, in which Iran can cooperate with the Americans if need be. Do you think that those things will also influence those relations going forward?
Of course, they may be influential in U.S.-Iran relations, but I think that Iran-U.S. relation is a huge catastrophe. That's just a resolution on that relationship would be something very far and not possible in near future. I think that many countries inside Middle East and abroad, and all the countries in the world, I can say that, are benefiting from this conflict, and they try to escalate this relationship by different tools and means. And we cannot find even one country in the world who is in favor of resolution. So I think that this resolution would not happen in a very near future, and we have to expect it. If it happens, we expect it in a very long trial and changes inside Middle East and inside the world.
Very well. We'll leave it there at that, but we appreciate both Atefeh and Robert for taking their time out and for discussing the latest when it comes to the Iran nuclear deal. We have the Rouhani administration, as I mentioned in my introduction, as well as Zarif, obviously, as a foreign minister, who is on their way out fairly soon when the Raisi administration then will take over. what does it mean for Rouhani to say, hey, listen, we can, if we so choose, purify uranium to a 90% purity level? Certainly that is probably for domestic consumption, or maybe it is a negotiating tactic, as one of our guests are alluded to. And then for Zarif to say we're one step away from a deal may also be a negotiating tactic. Maybe this is all meant to, in fact, be for foreign consumption more so than domestic consumption. The way I view it, as I put to our guests, is that I still feel like this is probably just a desperate move on the part of the Rouhani administration to remain relevant when it comes to the nuclear deal, and the fact that they have come under so much criticism of it essentially falling apart in front of all of our eyes. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.